Hey folks, Mark Scroggins back for another edition of the Reclamation Transformation, and we have Cindy Hyde with us again. How are you,
I'm
Cindy?
good, Mark. How are you?
I am good. So
Yeah.
let's just kind of jump back into it. And I think where
Okay.
we left off before was we started talking about the about post-separation abuse.
We did, yeah. And so, what most people don't realize is how common this is. And so, what happens is if you have been in a pathological love relationship or a relationship with a personality disordered individual, they don't stop targeting you just because you exit the relationship. In fact, you become more of a target, and most people don't realize that. So, what happens is what's called post separation abuse. And so this is where they will start working to turn the children against the safe parent, or they may even stalk the safe parent and accuse the safe parent of all kinds of things. They can also discredit the safe parent to the children, as well as
When you
withholding child support or financial support so that the safe parent struggles to provide for the children.
Let's kind of go one by one
Yeah.
on some of these, if you don't mind. So
Yeah.
when you talk about discrediting
Yeah.
the safe parent, can you give examples of what that would entail?
Yeah, I can. And there is a post separation abuse will. So, like, if anybody wants to know if they're being abused in this way, they can pull it up on Google and it'll
Okay.
pop up. But yeah, so they will discredit the parent by exploiting the children. And so they'll do that, for instance, like if they ask for the child on a football game night
Right.
and the safe parent says no because it's football game night, they'll
Right.
tell the child, well, I wanted to see you, but your mother wouldn't let me. And so then they start just insidiously discrediting the parent like that. Well, I wanted you to see a certain kind of doctor, but your mother insisted on. And so they'll do things like that where the child starts blaming the mother or the safe parent. And I want to kind of point out too that the safe parent is also the targeted parent, and the abusive parent is also the alienating parent. And so that's what can start happening is they slowly start turning the child against the safe parent.
Right. Uh,
Yeah.
so let's get a little bit into what this all kind of leads to, or is on the back end of, which is a lot of parental alienation.
Correct. Yeah. And the hard part is proving it, especially in the court
No
system, right?
kidding.
And you
Yeah.
know that because, oftentimes there's not physical abuse that presents in these types of cases.
Right.
And so, the safe parent has to document in order for a court to even recognize that they're being abused and that the children are being abused by being alienated from the safe parent. And so, but yeah, it absolutely, the children get turned against the safe parent, and they may even start parroting or mimicking the abusive parent to the safe parent. So then the safe parent is not only getting hurt by the abuser, they're then getting hurt by the children as well.
So what I want to do is I want to go through, we've got this great list
We
here
do.
of these 10 different things that the alienating parent frequently engages in. And so one, general bad mouthing.
Absolutely.
So
So,
here's the one. And so what I want to do is I want to look at it from your perspective, from that of the therapist,
Correct.
and then so it's interesting. I play both sides on this, right?
Right.
Depending on who I'm representing at the particular time. And sometimes I think it's really important to say, just because there are some of these,
right.
it does not necessarily mean that is what you are going into or going
Exactly.
through, right?
Exactly.
Okay? Because there are certain things that are a fine line. So, like this first one, general bad mouthing.
Yeah.
I know very few divorced parents who do not occasionally have
Sure.
something shitty to say
Absolutely.
about the other
Right,
parent.
right.
Right?
Well, and you're absolutely correct. But it's sort of like what we talked about in the previous episode about enduring patterns. So when it endures over time, it becomes a pattern.
Right.
And so what you as an attorney or a judge has to look at is this a pattern?
Right.
Or is this like this is just they're in the war of roses
Right.
and they hate each other and that's all this is. And so, but it's really about enduring patterns. So if the abuser is consistently calling the safe parent a whore
Right.
to the child,
Right.
well, that's an enduring pattern.
Absolutely.
Right?
Of course.
And that's abusive to the child to put that kind of image about the parent, regardless of whether she is or isn't,
Right.
into that child's mind. Right?
Yeah.
Because the child should still want to love their parent at whatever level they're capable of without that type of influence.
Right. So, and
right.
using, terminology like what you just talked about, calling the other person a whore or,
Right.
Something like that. There's a specific connotation that goes along with that, and it brings a lot more to the surface than just saying so-and-so's an asshole.
Exactly.
I mean, that's kind of, okay.
Right.
That's,
Yeah.
it's damn near like calling someone a jackass.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so that it's the ones where you use certain language like whore or is a crook or is
Yep.
this or
Right.
is that.
A liar.
Yeah.
Yep.
Those tend to, in my opinion, really raise the bar. Okay.
Absolutely.
The other ones, the ones that are scarier, are the ones that are like, oh, your dad's such an asshole.
Right.
Because okay, well,
Right.
dad might be an asshole part of the time.
Right.
He might be reacting to something also.
Right.
Or mom might be an asshole or something like
Right.
that. But when you start using certain language that has different connotation
Right.
to it, that's the one where it seems to me that's more easily identifiable, right?
Yeah.
It's the ones that are more borderline that
Right.
are scarier and
Right.
are harder from the standpoint of a practitioner as an attorney who represents people on
Right.
both sides, that the ones that are borderline, those are the ones that are more difficult.
Correct. Yeah. And how you can also tell if it's an enduring pattern is if the child starts calling the mom that too, or the safe
Right.
parent that too.
Right.
And because kids, especially the younger kids, they're little parrots, they're
Right.
going to repeat what they hear. And so if it's been consistent in the household or even post separation, the child's going to repeat it. And so that's another way that a judge or even an attorney can tell is if the child is repeating the behavior to the safe parent.
So the parroting is huge.
Correct.
Huge.
Correct.
Well, and that's a great thing to know, because there's certain things that would make sense for a child to parrot.
Correct.
If mom or dad doesn't go to my games or something like that,
Right.
that's one thing to be parroting that information.
Right.
But if they start parroting things like mom or dad's a liar, or
Right.
God forbid they start talking about, well, mom's such a whore, or
Right.
dad's he's a fraudster, or
Yeah.
God, I felt like that was a very old kind of term to use, a fraudster.
Right.
But using some terminology
Yeah.
like that,
I think it's
that,
con artist now.
or a con artist,
Yeah.
but something that wouldn't be normally part of their vernacular.
Right.
I think that's what should raise someone's questions an awful lot about.
Right.
Where are they picking that up
Right.
from?
Yeah. And an 8-year-old really wouldn't know that terminology,
Right.
and not parrot it consistently.
Right.
And that's how there's probably a pattern there, that there's an alienating parent that could be using that to alienate the child.
Right.
Yeah.
So then here's the next one, making the target parent appear dangerous or sick.
Yeah, and so the targeted parent is also the safe parent,
Right.
right? And so they may tell the child, your mother's crazy, or she's mentally ill, she's bipolar, or they may, give her undiagnosed diagnoses in front of the child.
Right.
And so a lot of times the safe parent is the emotional parent because they're getting attacked on a regular basis. And so a lot of times they're a lot more emotional than the abusive parent,
Yeah.
or can be. And so, if the safe parent has a meltdown or starts crying, they're made fun of or belittled, or the child is told that the parent is crazy and needs to be in a mental hospital.
Right.
So, so then the child, if it's an enduring pattern, starts believing that.
Right. Then here's one that is, God, this is borderline, sharing the child custody case or child support issues with the child.
Absolutely. And a lot, like you said, those borderline cases are guilty of that too.
Right.
Where they're sharing every detail. Well, your dad had multiple affairs.
Yeah.
Right. And I got into a discussion just recently with a client about that. Like, when should a child be told, if the child should be told? And I'm just not in agreement. Some therapists believe, oh yeah, absolutely, the child should know. I don't agree with that. I
don't
think
either.
it's very damaging to a child. That I don't think a child should, know about a parent's sex life until until they're out of the house. I mean,
Yeah.
I probably, you may get some hate mail over that, but I just think it's the appropriate thing to do is to keep that out of the child's life. I mean, they need to be focused on school and, football and soccer practices and whatever they're into and their friends and getting good grades and not what, drama is going on in the parent's life.
Yeah, I agree,
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
So I think that is totally uncalled for, and I've
Agreed.
had plenty of those where those are the ones that tend to jump out the most, where the emotions are riding so high that they want to make sure to tell the child that, look, it's your mom or your dad had an affair, and that's the reason that all this fell apart,
Yeah.
and yada yada yada. That one's an easily identifiable. Once the problem is those things that are where someone feels like they've got to fight fire with fire,
Right.
And here's something that, in my opinion, this is an area that needs to be revamped to a certain degree, because it's one thing if you've got 5 or 6 year olds at the house. It's another thing if they're between 10 and 12, and it's a whole nother thing if they're between 15 and 18.
Right.
So at what age are they entitled to know certain things,
Right.
rather than just getting a stiff arm?
Yeah.
Because I don't think a stiff arm I don't think that's a good way that you deal with especially older children, to tell them that we can't talk to you about anything.
Right.
Even though that's what the law is basically, or what, so all of these different courts, say in North Texas,
Right.
Have standing orders.
Right.
And so the standing orders all say, no discussion of the litigation. Well,
Right.
that's kind of a blanket statement, right?
Right.
So at
Yeah.
what point is a kid entitled to know,
Right.
well, where am I going to be on Friday night?
Yeah.
You know?
Exactly. And I think if the child's in high school or older and they're asking very direct questions, you don't want to lie to the child. But I think too, you can always say something along the lines of, I don't think this is what you should be focusing on in your high school years. But when you get out, if you want to know more details, then and you ask me directly, then I'll answer you and I'll tell you the truth, right?
Yeah.
And the safe parent, this is what I always guide my safe parents to do, is you're the voice of truth. So
Right.
you always start conversations saying, I will always tell you the truth, and here's the truth, right? And so they start learning that parent is always going to tell them the truth if they ask. And so I think it has to be age appropriate for sure. And some high school students are very mature and maybe could handle that. But again, you don't want them focusing on that in what's supposed to be the best years of their life, right? And so a safe parent will try to protect them from that, where an abusive parent will, if there was an affair by the safe parent, they will tell the child that. Yeah.
So here's another question though along those lines, because sometimes you have one spouse who is just absolutely devastated. Devastated.
Sure. Yes.
They do not really, they don't really want the divorce, but
Correct.
they are just blown away that the other parent, had an affair and how long it's been going on,
Sure.
and this, that, and the other. And so it's like they can't help themselves to a certain degree. They are in.
They're so wounded they tell. Yeah.
Exactly. So, there you have, it raises the problem of how do you discern between, someone who's so wounded and someone who's really trying to do harm to the other person.
And that actually happens a lot with abuse victims, is
Sure.
that they're the devastated one, even though they've been abused all of this time, and maybe there was multiple affairs, and they'll beg and plead for the relationship not to be over,
Right.
Because they're in such a wounded state, and they will inadvertently share things with the children they shouldn't do. And a lot of that is because the abusive parent is bad-mouthing them, and so they feel like they have to defend themselves and say, I don't want this, and I'm trying, I've been trying to make him happy for years, and so
Right.
they'll tell too much in their wounded state, and they may be in that victim role because
Right.
they feel so victimized. So yeah, it's absolutely true, which makes it also difficult for the court to determine who is the safe parent, because if
Exactly.
the victimized parent is in that victim role, they're going to share way too much. And
Oh, no
so,
question.
yeah.
No
And
question.
so, but a lot of times what, I think we see is that it comes down to, like, once the custody arrangements are made and child support is being, negotiated and settled, what can happen a lot of times is the abusive parent will, if they're self-employed, will lower their wages to make it look like they're not making any money. And so then the victimized parent will tell the children, like, he doesn't pay for anything, he doesn't pay enough child support, and they become even more victimized through that process of being financially abused by the abusive parents. So there's all these dynamics that can come into play over child custody even.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is, there's no question that kind of thing happens. There's also no question that sometimes people actually don't have the ability to make the same amount of money. So it's,
right.
once again, I mean, it's one of those that's super, super difficult to discern what's true and what's false in a lot of these.
Yeah.
Here's one that should be pretty apparent. Accusing the targeted parent of not loving the child.
Correct. Yeah. So, if your mother loved you, she would let you go to Disneyland with me, even though it's during the school year.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so, or, if your mother loved you, she would be taking you to these nice restaurants because I give her a ton of child support. She can afford it. She spends your child support money on herself.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's that kind of abuse. Right. And
Right.
the child, they're the innocent person and they believe that.
Right.
Right. And so that's kind of ways that can happen. Yeah.
See, and that's an area I think that where, frankly, it makes more sense for kids to be educated to a certain degree to understand that child support doesn't mean that, let's say you're paying max guideline for one child, which
Right.
is $18.40 a month.
Right.
That doesn't mean that $18.40 a month is supposed to go into their pocket.
Right.
Which is
Right.
what a lot of children
Right.
think that means. It's supposed to pay for housing and food and
Yeah.
clothing
Yeah.
and transportation and all of these different things that don't mean,
Right.
how much money do I have to spend on whatever the hell I want
Right.
to spend it on.
Exactly. And, it's interesting that 1840 is now the number. That's about what you can get a one-bedroom apartment for in the Dallas Metroplex now. And so a lot of times these single parents are in very small accommodations,
Yeah.
by themselves, especially if they didn't make a lot of money. So then you tack on any kind of activities or, because a lot of times the abusive parent will go, well, I'm giving you the max child support. I'm not paying for that football uniform. You need to take it out of your $10 an hour salary.
Right.
Well, now I think it's like 18 now with whatever the lowest is. But anyway, so there can still be so much abuse even if they're paying the maximum. Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it goes both ways. I mean, I've
Right.
also represented some people who have been stay-at-home parents that, they
Oh, yeah.
they
Me too.
can't understand that they might actually have to get a job and
Correct.
work, and that
Right.
why isn't it that their lifestyle should be supported? And I said, because that's not the state you live in.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
there are a lot of people that don't seem to understand that. So like when we
Right.
talk about 1840 and
Right.
that being basically what a one bedroom costs,
Right.
I agree. It's ridiculous what the cost is now.
Yeah.
But when you are getting that child support, that is just for part. It means you need to contribute part too,
as well.
Because
Absolutely.
both parents have the
Right.
responsibility
Right.
to take care of the child during their periods of possession.
Right.
So that child support is supposed to pay for a lot of different
Absolutely.
different stuff.
Right. Yeah,
So-
and then that's definitely a two-way street.
Yeah.
And so I agree. A lot of times, like to your point, I have several clients that were married many, many, many years, did not
Right.
work, and now are having to figure out how am I going to get a job with a 30-year gap in employment.
Exactly.
Right. And so it's not as easy, as like just going and getting a job. They can,
Right.
but it may be a very low-paying job until they can get established again as an employee. Yeah.
Super difficult. And that's one of the rare times. Now, as you know, the presumption in Texas is that you shouldn't get spousal maintenance.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
However, this is one of the times that I
Right.
think spousal maintenance is really,
I
really
agree.
appropriate and should be utilized because it's used to help get back out into the workforce. So,
Right.
let's say you got a marketing degree from the University of Texas,
Mm-hmm.
in 1990.
Right.
Okay. And you have stayed home and you have had kids. And here it is, 33 years later,
Right.
and now you need to rejoin the workforce.
Right.
Well, guess what? A whole lot has changed. So, is there
Right.
additional certification that you could get? Is there additional training that you
Right.
need to become relevant?
Right.
I'm going to gather the answer is yes
Yeah.
to that.
Yeah.
So that's one of the areas that can actually be utilized. However, you still have to show that you're not getting enough,
Right.
from the division of the marital estate, which
Right.
is kind of,
Yeah, that's a whole nother.
that's a whole nother one because that's
Right.
so subjective. It's not
Correct.
objective at
Right.
all. So,
Right. Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of scary. So, then here's another one: defaming the targeted parent in front of the authorities.
Yeah.
So when we talk about in front of the authorities, I mean, what exactly do you mean by that? Because that's a very generalized term.
Yeah, it's not uncommon at all for the abusive parent to keep the children longer than what the agreement says. And they'll terrify the safe parent. And so if the authorities get called, then the abusive parent may say, well, she's, look how emotional she is. She can't take care of the kids anyway. And because they're also a legal parent, there's really nothing the authorities can do. But I've had clients go to jail because they went to retrieve their child after being kept longer than they should have been. And so because they're banging on the door and looking like a crazy person, then the authorities come, and then the abusive parent is calm.
So that is
Right.
that is a perfect explanation as to why there's no such thing as legal separation in the
Right.
state of Texas.
Correct.
And that is a perfect example of why it is so important. If you're going to separate,
Yeah.
okay, unless there's really a good chance
Right.
of reconciliation, you need to have something on file.
Absolutely.
And even, attorneys all the time enter into what are called Rule 11 agreements related to, possession and access of the child. And
Right.
that gives you a basis for if they don't return the children at the right time,
good.
that you can look at, filing a contempt motion
Oh, that's good
against
to
them,
know.
an
Yeah.
enforcement motion. And so if you're in the middle of litigation, or if it's after the case has been resolved, where you've got a possession and access schedule, a parenting plan
Right.
that lays all this stuff out. Hell, if they keep too late, don't
Right.
do anything to go over there and bang crazy on the door.
Right.
File an enforcement,
Right.
file a writ of habeas corpus.
Right.
There are a whole bunch of different things that can be done there that you will absolutely take it to the other person, where they will get their happy butts thrown in jail over
Right.
that kind of stuff.
That's great.
Instead of the innocent parent,
safe parent, right.
exactly. They're doing
Yeah.
something that, you would think
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah.
I know if I was in that situation, I'd want to go break the door down.
Oh, absolutely.
You know?
And we all get the Amber Alerts, right?
Yes,
like how often
absolutely.
do you read those, and it's a parent that has taken the children, and my mind always goes to, is that the safe parent that went and got the children, and and is not bringing them back now because they know that the child has been with the abusive parent.
Right.
So it could go either way. It could be the abusive parent that takes off with them. But I always
Right.
wonder about that dynamic when I see that. Yeah.
So then they've got restricting visitation or withholding contact information. So restricting visitation, that's the same scenario that I just mentioned. Okay. So not only can someone keep the kids too long, they can also withhold and say, I'm not turning the kids over.
Correct.
Don't raise,
Right.
raise some big stink over it. Just quietly contact your lawyer
Right.
and file an enforcement motion
Right.
and look to hold them in contempt. If they're
Yeah.
held in contempt, they're going to jail.
Yeah. And what happens at times, and I've had this happen with clients where, the child, got manhandled a little too hard on a visitation, and then the child comes home and tells the safe parent about it. Well, then the safe parent doesn't want to let the child go again.
Right.
And but they're forced to by the court to make them go, or they're in contempt if they don't make the child go. So sometimes they'll restrict, trying to keep the child safe. And so, but then when the child is asked by the authorities or a judge, they'll say it didn't happen because they're afraid of that abusive parent. And so like it's this whole, I mean, it's like a hamster wheel of things that can happen,
It is.
you know, in that situation, but also withholding contact. I have several clients who their children are old enough to have cell phones.
Right.
And the abusive parent won't let them contact the safe parent while they're with them.
Yeah.
And so, and to me that, you know, and I think a lot of people would agree that's abusive to the child, you know, to not let them have contact with the safe parent.
So it's interesting. So the lesson in all of these things right now that we're talking about are talk to your lawyer, because the vast majority of these things are going to be solved
Right.
by the courts. So let's say that you've got a situation like you just
Yeah.
mentioned where kid got manhandled a little bit ago, let's say over at dad's, okay? Got manhandled a little bit at dad's. Mom is freaked out
Yeah.
and does not want to let him go back, okay?
Yep.
So the smart thing is to immediately contact your attorney, and you can go in and file a restraining order to try to keep that from happening. And then, you know, if the court grants it, you don't have to turn that kid over. If the court does not grant it,
Right.
you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, and you have to let the kid go over.
Yeah.
But, you know, things with a phone, this is another thing why you want to hire a really good family law attorney, preferably someone who's board certified,
Right.
or, you know, a firm that's run by board certified lawyers, because this is all about good drafting. Typically, you're going to have periods of time of electronic communication.
Right.
You know, whether that's an iPad, you know, and you're FaceTiming,
Right.
or God, is Skype even a thing anymore? Now it's just
Yeah, it's
Microsoft
pretty much
owns it.
FaceTime
So,
nowadays,
right,
yeah.
right, exactly. So, but whether you do that or whether it's just calling on the phone,
Right.
they're typically going to have a period of time for these communications to take place. The rationale being they don't want to see that
Right.
abused, which it happens all the time. You see a child go over to mom or dad, and the other parent is calling, I want to talk to Johnny. I want to
Right.
talk to Johnny.
correct.
I want to
Yeah.
talk to Johnny. And
Right.
it's not like they can have any time
Right.
just to themselves. So it's another one of these fine line
Right.
situations. So,
Yeah.
you know, I will tell you that sometimes it's best to let the court make these determinations.
Right.
If you're wondering, is there something that can be done? Let them make
Let
that
them figure it
determination
out.
for you, so you don't end up,
Yeah.
you know, between a
Yeah.
rock and a hard place.
Yeah,
on it.
and then, you know, just even in your example, the, you know, parent repeatedly calling, insisting on talking
Yes.
to the child.
Horrible.
That can make the safe parent look bad if they don't let the child talk, and then they'll say, "Well, I called 100 times and your mother would not let me talk to you."
That's
so
right.
but it could also be the victimized parent, you know, having anxious attachment issues that they cannot let that child go because they're so scared for them.
Right.
And so they'll keep calling because they're just terrified of what could be happening to the child outside of their watch.
Right.
So like it, you know, again, hamster wheel on who's telling the truth, who's not, and what are truly the dynamics.
Well,
Yeah.
and it, you know, so here's the other thing to think. There have been societal changes that I do not think are very good. One of those you see is where mom or dad are, let's say Johnny gets a bad grade, okay? Instead of teaching Johnny to deal with it, they're calling the teacher and raising hell with the teacher of,
Yeah.
I can't believe that little Johnny got a B here.
Yes.
Don't you know, blah, blah, blah,
Right.
blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you've got that same kind of scenario that is going on in these situations.
Right.
And I don't know how you address
Right.
some of this stuff, you know. I mean, it's societal changes. I mean, you know, there are the jokes out there
Right.
of, you know, you even have someone who doesn't get, you know, they're out in the workforce and they don't get,
Right.
you know, a raise, or they don't get a promotion, and you've got a parent calling
Yes.
the employer.
Yeah. And the
you know?
child learns that they're always going to get rescued.
That's exactly right.
And then they don't have to have accountability in those situations.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's a whole nother podcast, Mark.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's like sharing parental conflict and marriage issues with the child.
Yeah.
We kind of talked
Yeah,
about
we
that.
did.
I think, like you said, at the right age,
Right.
I find some of it still rather distasteful, but you know, at a certain age, they're, you know, they can make up their
Yeah.
own minds,
Right.
you know,
Right.
and hopefully they are mature enough to understand that they don't understand what all of the dynamics were of the relationship between their parents.
Yeah, and you know, hopefully the safe parent, you know, will have the means to get good therapy.
Right.
You know, because, you know, when that time comes, you know, a safe parent would say, so even no matter how bad the abusive person was that they were involved with, you know, they would be able to say, I don't want to cause you not to love your father.
Right.
You know, but yes, there were things in our marriage that we couldn't come back from. And like, for instance, there was a third party involved in our marriage, you know, so they can position it in a very healthy way that doesn't cause the child, if the child, you know, is still attached to that, the abusive parent, that it doesn't ruin their perspective of that parent.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Even though they may really want to. Yeah.
Oh, no question. Well, and you know, so the other
Yeah.
side of that is, and something I
Yeah.
will always tell parents, tell people, look, if you're thinking about having an affair, that's probably telling you something,
Yeah.
and that, you know, your needs are not being met,
Yeah.
and usually it's not your sexual needs that are not being met,
Correct.
it's something else.
Oh, absolutely.
You know?
Yeah.
But it is amazing to me, those that are in a sexless marriage, that they're like, we're going to stick it out for the kids.
Yeah.
And it's like, you're really not doing the kids any favors.
No, you're not.
For that.
If they grow up never seeing affection or never seeing that loving,
Exactly.
correct? Yeah.
Exactly.
What
So-
kind of relationships you think they're going to get into? Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like we're going to be two stoics, you know, who don't
exactly.
show any kind of affection towards one another.
Correct.
And that's not very healthy.
Yeah, not at all.
So,
yeah, absolutely.
Making negative remarks about the targeted parent's extended or new family.
Yeah. And so, you know, like say the safe parent gets remarried, right?
Right.
Which is also the targeted parent.
Right.
Say they remarry, and let's just say they remarry Joe. You
Right.
know, and so then the abusive parent will start belittling Joe and saying, you know, oh, he's, you know, he doesn't have a brain in his head. And, you know, look how he married, you know, your mother has a million men besides Joe, and look what an idiot he is, right? And so they'll do those kinds of things to undermine the new family coming in, or they'll even talk about the grandparents. Well, you know, Joe's parents pay for everything, that's why he can't hold a job, or you know, and so they'll just have a lot of judgment about the new parent and the family to the child, which again
Right.
is so inappropriate.
Right.
But you know, personality disordered, you know, individual, if that's what's involved, you know, the children are possessions. It's not because they have love for the child, because they don't feel that emotion. That's not an emotion they can feel. And so, you know, it's about using the child as a possession to harm the targeted parent, because the parent that is the safe parent is the targeted parent. They're the
Right.
parent that will always be targeted for as long as the children are under 18.
Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe even still after that. Yeah.
Here's another one. Intercepting calls and messages from the targeted parent.
Right. And it's kind of like what we talked about before. Won't let them use their phone to call the
Right.
safe or targeted parent, or will answer the child's phone and, you know, then start abusing the parent on the phone in front of the child, or even not in front of the child, but they'll use it as an opportunity to abuse further.
Or just doing, you know, just taking those calls and not informing the child. So, you
Yeah.
know, if they say, did mom or dad call? Didn't hear a word.
Yeah.
You know, that kind of
Yeah.
thing. So this last one is pretty extreme, hiding the child or moving away.
Yeah.
You
yeah.
know.
Well, and you know, we don't hear about that as much in our culture, even though it happens actually all the time. But we hear about it in cultures that are from other countries, and you'll hear about them running back to Mexico, or running to the Middle
True.
East with their child, or running to Europe with their child. You know, wherever they're from.
Right.
And that happens a lot.
Yeah.
And you hear about those usually on the news, because then it becomes kind of an international thing.
Right.
But you know, the ones that happen right here in our backyard, you know, because they might take a child to California and then disappear.
Right.
And so it does happen, absolutely, and it's a way to still abuse the targeted parent.
Yeah, and that's when you start dealing with you know, the stuff internationally, and if the other country is not part of the Hague Convention,
Correct.
even if they are a party to the Hague Convention, you know, it can be super difficult.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and let's just hope if your child gets taken and moved away, they take them to the UK because they do have a coercive control bill over there. So,
yeah, exactly,
yeah.
exactly. So
Yeah.
here are a couple other things I wanted to get into, and we've got signs of malicious parental behavior and signs of children with malicious parent syndrome.
Correct.
So these are related, and I want to talk about those a little bit because the thing that concerns me specifically, and I think concerns most of us, is what is the impact going to be on the kids? So
Right.
what are you going to see? Some child who has been subjected to this, even though it doesn't appear from a lot of the activity that they are the target,
Right.
while
Yeah.
they're the ones who feel
Yeah.
the cause of this. So actually, let's talk about the signs of children with malicious parents syndrome.
Yeah, and malicious parent syndrome, just so you know, is also
alienate.
parental alienation.
Right.
And that's what most people know it as. But
Right.
I actually do like the terminology malicious parent syndrome because that is what it is. It's an abusive parent
Right.
that has, now damaged the children because of their abusive targeting towards the safe parent. Yeah.
Right. So one of the things it says is that children with malicious, gosh, I can't talk today. One of the things it says that children with malicious parent syndrome or parental alienation that have suffered from that will see is older children show reluctance and refusal of parental visits.
Yeah, because they've been so damaged by the abusive parent in, learning how to name call the parent or parrot or mimic the abusive parent. So then when it's time for the safe parent to pick up the child, they'll refuse to go or not want to go because they've been so poisoned by the abusive parent that the safe parent is bad or that they're the abuser or that they're sick or mentally unstable. And so then they adopt that and then they don't want to go with the parent.
So I think one of the things we talk about a lot is document, because this is another one of those that you can see 100% from the other side as well.
Exactly.
And so it's super important, I think, to make sure that all of that stuff, all of that behavior is documented because I've been on the side a number of times of someone who the kids have just absolutely had it with the other parent.
Correct.
And, and the other parent was, oh no, the other side is alienating the children from me, which is a great response to that because it's two sides of the same coin.
Right.
So document.
Right. And and you're exactly right. And that's one of the first things I tell my clients as well is, you have no choice because you don't have bruises. If you had bruises, this would be so much easier, but you don't. And so you have to document every little thing, even if you think it's unimportant.
Yep, completely agree. So it says also, children will reflexively ally with the alienating parents while rejecting the target parents or the safe parents without justifiable cause.
Yeah. And so, that happens a lot as well, where they become allies with the abuser because they don't know. All they're hearing is the poison of that parent. And so, especially depending on the trauma response of the safe parent, which if the safe parent's trauma response is fight, well, then they look like the crazy person, right? So then that aligns with what the abuser tells the parent, right? If the trauma response is freeze and the safe parent doesn't stand up for themselves, then the child can ally with the abuser because they're not speaking up and saying anything different. And so they only have the poison they're being fed as what the truth is.
Right. What I think is so important here is the last part of this, without justifiable cause.
Right.
So it's super important to really analyze, are they pissed because of stuff that they have heard?
Right.
Or are they pissed because of something they have personally experienced?
Exactly.
So really important to dig down on that.
Yeah.
So
for sure. And that too, I think, if a child has to go in front of a judge, and where judges can learn in this area is exactly what you just said. Is this just a reaction by the child,
Right.
or is this truly been a pattern that the child has learned?
Right.
Yeah.
So here is another one where kids insist their feelings for the safe parents are their own independent
Yes.
judgment, not
Yes.
influenced by the vindictive parents.
Yeah, and a lot of times they're mimicking and parroting the abusive parent and so if they have to go in front of a judge, they'll tell the judge, "No, this is what I really think," when actually they have no other evidence that the child, so the child's just simply adopting what they've been told by
Right.
the abusive parent. Because a lot of times the abusive parent is a lot more vocal
Right.
than the safe parent, because the safe parent usually is scared, or they're in a trauma response and they don't know how to fight for themselves or advocate for themselves. And so all the child is hearing is the abuser. And so then they'll just become that, and they'll start saying the exact same things, but they think that, have you ever heard that saying that says somebody won't do something unless they think it's their idea? So if you're trying to convince them of something, you have to convince them that it's their idea,
Yep.
right? Same thing. So the child will be convinced that it's actually their thinking when in fact it's not.
Right.
Yeah.
I think this is another one of those situations where you have to look at, is the child feeling a specific way, or at least espousing something that is based on something they have actually personally experienced, or is it something where they're just hearing, yada 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 yada
Right.
yada, and that is what they're saying.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So this one is one I've never personally experienced. They believe the aligned parents can do no wrong.
Yeah.
Haven't quite ever experienced that as a parent.
Right. Right.
But so that's
So your
one.
child tells you you're wrong all the time. Is
I
that what
hear
you're
that
saying, Mark?
all the damn time. Yes, all the
Yeah.
time.
Well, actually this does happen, and here's how it happens. And I don't know if you remember when we talked about the power and control will the last time, and how oftentimes the abuser will use what's called male privilege. So they become the god of the house. They become the judge and jury of all people, right? And so anytime that the child is in the company of the abusive parent, the abusive parent is very judgmental of everything and everyone going around them. And so they start seeing that parent as the god of the house, or as the knower of all. And so they do start thinking that parent can do no wrong.
Yeah, that one can be very difficult
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
So they also say kids make false accusations of the targeted parent without supporting details or facts. That's crazy scary. Crazy scary.
Yeah.
Where all of a sudden now the kids have become indoctrinated, for lack of a better way of putting it, into this abusive cycle. And now
Right.
they're coming up with what is in effect BS.
Yeah, and sometimes the children can become just as abusive to that parent because they've been programmed for it. And so yeah, so like for instance, your mother is the one that, she's cheated for years with every guy that looked at her. Right, even though she's never been the one that cheated, that was projection from the abusive parent.
Right.
So the child then starts going, well, you're a cheater and you're a whore. That's what dad said, and I believe that. And so, yeah, so they absolutely, the safe parent can become very abused by even the children in that way. Yeah.
And then that dovetails into this lack of guilt about their antagonistic behavior toward the other parent.
Right. Right, because the abusive parent, especially if they're personality disordered, never showed empathy towards the safe parent. And so because of that, the children grow up and they don't show empathy towards the safe parent either, because remember, the safe parent has been painted as the bad guy,
Right.
even though they're the safe parent. Yeah.
Then says kids can also use the aligned parent stories or explanations to articulate why they despise the other parent.
Very much like what they'll do in front of a judge is they'll
Right.
just simply repeat everything they've heard from the abusive parent, and they actually align with that and believe that it's true.
And then this last one, it's really a guilt by association. They will show, negative behavior towards others who are associated with the other parents.
Yeah. Yeah, they will. And so if they don't like the safe parent because they've been conditioned not to, then they won't approve or like anybody that's associated with them, especially if it's a new suitor.
Right.
And so, and then, the unsafe parent is bad mouthing the new person coming in, then the children will be very reactive to that new person.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this is a difficult thing to get through and understand exactly which
Right.
way is up. So I think if there's anything to really take from it, it's document everything. Make sure you talk to a good lawyer about everything.
Most definitely.
And make sure you have a fantastic therapist to
Right.
help you through the
Right.
situation.
And I would say, and don't let your fear keep you from talking to a good lawyer, because a good lawyer can help you with an exit strategy if you don't have one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
So-
Cindy, thank you so much. I will look forward to our next discussion here. And thank you all for joining us today on another edition of the Reclamation Transformation. Don't forget, change starts with you. Leave your mark.